The candle guttered as the creditor's finger traced the Latin above the chapel door. She did not translate it for him. Florentia Sackville bent lower over the torn chapel curtain, russet wool at the wrist, a soiled apron across her knees, and let the man believe she could not read. Beneath the coarse brown shawl, a leather cord bit into her throat. At the end of the cord, hidden against her corset, hung a heavy iron key the late Duke had pressed into her palm the night before he died. Outside, the October wind moved through broken windows the household could no longer afford to glaze. The London papers had a new name for Netherby Castle that season. They called it a pauper's grave. The carriage arrived at dusk. Two men stepped down onto the cracked flagstones. The taller wore an ink-dark tailcoat, mirror-polished hessians, and a heavy gold signet ring that caught the last light. A pale saber scar cut through his right brow. He mistook her for a housemaid and asked for the lady of the castle. Quietly, without lifting her eyes, Florentia corrected him. That night the solicitor read the ledgers aloud in the cold library. £47,000, one creditor, 6 weeks, and a warrant already drawn against the Duke's younger brother. But what the new Duke of Netherby did not yet know was what the old Duke had locked inside the chapel crypt, and what the girl in the plain russet gown had already read on the lid of the vault. Before the story begins, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of justice, dignity, and love that arrives against all odds move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. October of 1818 came down on Netherby Castle in a slow gray rain, and the rain found every crack the stonemasons had left unmended for 30 years. Water ticked from the ribs of the chapel vault onto the marble flags where the Wyndham dead lay in a row of black slabs. Somewhere in the west wing, a shutter clapped against a broken hinge. The castle, once the pride of 3 counties, sounded now like a ship that no one had bothered to caulk. Florentia Sackville sat on a low stool in the chapel with a single tallow candle at her elbow and a curtain of moth-eaten crimson velvet across her lap. She was 22. Her hazel green eyes tracked the needle. Her dark hair had been pulled into a low chignon that morning and had not been thought of since. The russet merino gown she wore was the same one she had worn on Tuesday and Thursday, and the linen apron over it had a soot mark near the hem that she had given up trying to lift. Her hands were what a stranger would have noticed first. They were reddened at the knuckles, chapped along the thumb, marked here and there by the small pale nicks that come from wringing out cold water in a house with no maid to do it. They moved, all the same, with a fine, patient economy, drawing the needle in and out of a tear along the chapel curtain in stitches so small they would have shamed a milliner in Bond Street. The tear was not new, neither was the mending. She had been at this curtain for 3 evenings. Under the coarse linen of her collar, held there by a plain leather cord, a heavy iron key rested cold against her breastbone. She was aware of it as one is aware of a scar. She did not touch it. She had learned, over the last 4 months, not to touch it. A boot rang on the flags at the far end of the nave. Florentia did not lift her head. The rhythm of the needle went on. She had learned that too. That surprise made a house look poor faster than any ledger. "Miss," said a voice she did not know, and the voice was oily and pleased with itself. "A word, if I may." He came into the ring of her candle without waiting to be asked. A small clerkish man in a plum coat gone shiny at the elbows. His nose was pink from the wet. In one gloved hand he carried a leather portfolio too fat for the papers it held. In the other, a copy of the Morning Post folded so that a particular paragraph faced outward. He did not, she noted, remove his hat inside the chapel. "Mr. Selby, of Threadneedle Street." He inclined a fraction. "On behalf of a client. The Duke is not in residence. So I am given to understand." He smiled without warmth. "It is not the Duke I have come to look upon. It is the door." She set another stitch. "The chapel door." "Just so." She let him wait. He shifted from one foot to the other, and the flags gave back a small wet complaint. Behind him, through the open door of the nave, she could see the porch, and above the porch the great stone lintel, where the Netherby motto had been cut in the year 1462, worn now, but still legible to a patient eye. "The inscription, miss," said Selby, and produced from an inner pocket a stub of pencil and a much-thumbed notebook. "In the Latin, my client wishes it, Transcribed. For the record. For which record? For the schedule of assets, Miss Sackville. Miss Sackville. He tried the smile again. You are a retainer of the family? I am a cousin of the family. The pencil stopped moving. His eyes traveled over the russet gown, the apron, the chapped hands, and came back to her face with a new arithmetic in them. She saw him decide, quite openly, that a cousin who mended curtains at 8 o'clock at night with a tallow candle was a cousin who could be spoken to as a servant. Well, he said, cousin, if you would be so good as to bring me a lantern, the stone is high and the light is poor. I will bring you no lantern. He blinked. The chapel is not on any schedule of assets, Florentia said. She did not raise her voice. She did not put down the curtain. The chapel and its lintel and its inscription were placed in trust for the parish in 1541 by the third Duke, and no writ of any creditor reaches into a parish trust. You will know this, Mr. Selby, if your client is who I think he is. Selby's mouth opened a small, careful distance. You are here, she went on, to look at the door, because the door has been drawn in a broadsheet, and the broadsheet has been shown in a coffee house, and someone has told your client that the words above it prove something about the estate. It proves nothing about the estate. It is a prayer for the parish dead. Miss Sackville, you may of course transcribe it. It is public stone, but you will do so without the loan of anything of ours, and you will do so in the rain, which I understand has not thinned. For a moment, Selby looked at her with the flat, startled attention of a man who has stepped onto what he took for a rug and discovered a trap door. Then the professional smoothness came back over him, like oil closing on water. Very good, miss. He touched the brim of his hat, at last. I shall not detain you at your needlework. The needle went in, the needle came out. He walked to the porch and stood a long time under it, staring up. She heard the pencil scratch. She heard him mutter and mutter again, and try a phrase, and cross it out. He did not know Latin. Neither, she suspected, did his client. They had come for the shape of the letters, not the sense of them, so that a paragraph in tomorrow's post might carry the words in italics beneath a woodcut of a crumbling arch. She had known the sense of them since she was 9. Requiescant in pace qui hic dormiunt et qui super eos vigilent. May they who sleep here rest in peace, and they also who watch over them. The old Duke had made her repeat it in his study, evening after winter evening, correcting her vowels with the mild patience of a man teaching a niece, who had come to him at 12, with nothing but a black dress and a black trunk. Nobody in the parish knew she had that Latin. Nobody in the castle knew. Selby, scratching under the porch, did not know. It was the first thing in her keeping that was truly her own, and she had learned to keep it, as she had learned to keep the key, close and quiet against her body. The candle guttered. She trimmed it with 2 fingers. The rain slackened. Selby, defeated by declensions, tucked the notebook away and let himself out through the churchyard gate without a farewell. She heard the gate strike its post and then, at some distance, a horse taking to the London road at a resentful trot. She sat a moment longer with the curtain across her knees. Then she folded it, set it on the pew, licked her thumb, pinched the candle, and stood. The chapel was black. She did not need light for the walk back to the castle. She had made it in the dark every night since August. Along the yew walk the wind pushed at her shawl and lifted the small hairs at her nape. Above the west range, a single window still showed a rushlight. The housekeeper, Mrs. Doyle, sitting up over the accounts she could not, poor woman, quite read. Beyond that, the castle was a great slab of shadow with holes in the roof where slate had come down in the September gales. Nobody had climbed up to lay new slate. There was no money to buy slate. There was, at the last count Florentia had seen, no money to buy candles that were not tallow, or coal that was not the poor gritty stuff from the smaller pit, or bread that was not yesterday's. She let herself in at the scullery door. The kitchen was warm from a low fire. Mrs. Doyle sat at the deal table with a shawl over her shoulders and a folded newspaper laid open under her hand. He gone, miss? He is gone. He'll be back. Not with a lantern from me. Mrs. Doyle's mouth twitched. She was a broad gray woman of 60, with hands like a coachman's and a fondness, quite hidden from the household, for her young mistress. She pushed the paper across the table with one blunt finger. They've done it again. Florentia did not sit. She stood at the table and read. The paragraph was in the 3rd column of the Morning Post. It was headed, in a small mocking italic, "The Pauper's Grave." It described, without naming anyone, a certain ducal seat in the north, once the pride of 3 counties, whose noble halls now serve as a pauper's grave for the last of a great name, and whose creditors, the word creditors carried a small, elegant sting, gather at the gate as ravens gather at a battlefield. She read it twice. She read it, the second time, with the same fine, patient economy with which she had drawn the needle through the velvet. Her face did not change. "They have used it 3 Tuesdays running," Mrs. Doyle said. "Pauper's Grave. It's a fine phrase for a coffee house. Someone is paying to have it printed, miss." "I know. Do you know who?" "I have my guess." Mrs. Doyle waited. Florentia did not give it. "His Grace is coming, they say." "So they say." "They say the young Duke has been sold out of the regiment. Bought out. There is a difference." Mrs. Doyle grunted. "Not to a creditor there isn't." Florentia laid the paper down. She smoothed the crease with the edge of her palm, as one might smooth a shroud. "Set a fire in the library," she said quietly. "Not the big grate, the small one, at the writing desk, and find me the ledger from July, the green one with the split spine." "Miss, he will not come tonight. He will come tomorrow, or the day after. When he comes, he will ask for the ledger, and the ledger will be on the desk, and he will find that at least one thing in this house has been kept." Mrs. Doyle looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once, folded the paper in half, and went out with her rushlight to the library. Florentia stood alone in the kitchen, with her hand still resting on the newsprint. Under her collar, against the bone of her breastbone, the iron key was as cold as it had been in the chapel. Colder, perhaps. She let herself, for the first time that day, close her eyes. Behind the closed eyes, she saw the old Duke as she had last seen him. He had been sitting up in the great bed in the tapestry room, thin as a folded knife, and he had put the key into her palm and closed her fingers over it with fingers of his own that were already the color of tallow. "When a worthy man knocks," he had said in his careful lecturer's Latin, so that the doctor at the door should not hear, "you will open. Not before, not for any writ, not for any paper in any hand. Do you understand me, Florentia?" And she had said, "Yes, uncle." And he had said, in English then, and quietly, as if it were the last favor a man might ask of a young cousin, "They will call this house a pauper's grave. Do not let them bury me alive in it." She opened her eyes. She went to the small looking-glass by the scullery door and looked at herself as if at a stranger who had come in from the rain. The chignon had loosened at the nape. There was a smear of candle soot along the line of her jaw. Her collar was clean, at least. She had washed it that morning in a basin of gray water and hung it by the kitchen fire. She lifted her chin a half-inch and set the collar straight, and in the glass a woman of 22 looked back at her with a mouth that had learned, in 4 months, not to tremble. "Pauper's Grave," she said aloud, softly, to the woman in the glass. The woman in the glass did not answer. Florentia turned from the looking-glass and walked through the flagged passage to the great hall. The hall was cold. The tall portraits along the wall were sheeted in Holland, all except one, the third Duke, in armor, with the same motto on a scroll in the corner. Requiescant in pace, she passed under him without lifting her eyes. At the foot of the great stair she stopped. From the head of the stair, some 50 feet above her in the dark, came a small, hesitant tapping. She listened. It was only the shutter in the long gallery, come loose again in the wet. She went up. She went along the gallery with her hand trailing on the paneling for a guide. She stopped at the 6th window from the end, where the shutter was banging, and she opened the casement, and she reached out into the wet dark and drew the shutter to and fastened it, and closed the casement behind it, and locked it. She did all this in the pitch dark. She knew, without seeing them, the position of the catch, of the pin, of the small notched brass fitting her uncle's father had put in when she was born. When she turned from the window, a lantern was coming along the gallery towards her. Mrs. Doyle. And behind Mrs. Doyle, another light, further off, at the head of the servants' stair, one of the 2 remaining maids, sent up because Mrs. Doyle had heard the shutter and been alarmed. "It's only me," Florentia said. "The shutter. It is fastened now." "Miss," Mrs. Doyle came up close and dropped her voice, though there was no one to hear. "There is a man at the north gate." Florentia went very still. "Not Selby. Not Selby. A gentleman, tall, on horseback. He has asked for the Duke, And when I said the Duke is not here, he laughed, and he said, "Then I am arrived." And he said his name, miss. What name? Mrs. Doyle's face in the lantern light was old and frightened and, under the fear, oddly proud. Wyndham, she said. Osmond Wyndham. For a heartbeat, Florentia felt the iron key at her breastbone go warm, as if some other hand had closed on it from the other side of the linen. She did not put her fingers to it. She smoothed her apron. She set her collar straight for the second time that night. "Bring him in by the great door," she said. "Not the scullery. Light the sconces in the hall as far as you have candles. If you have not candles enough, light every third one, and let the shadow do the rest. Miss, your dress?" "He will see the dress." Her voice was level. "Let him see it. Bring him in." Mrs. Doyle went. The maid went with her. Florentia stood alone in the gallery in the pitch dark for a count of 10. And in that 10 counts, she said nothing, and thought a great deal. Then she went down the great stair, one hand on the banister, and took her place at the foot of it under the sheeted portrait of the third Duke. A great door opened somewhere at the far end of the hall. Cold air came in, and the candles Mrs. Doyle had lit stooped all together and stood up again. A boot rang on the flags, then another. A tall shadow crossed the sheeted portraits and came on, unhurried, into the little pool of light where Florentia stood, and stopped, and looked down at her from a height of 6 feet and 1 inch, with storm-gray eyes, and a pale saber scar cutting through the right eyebrow. He did not bow. He looked instead, once at her collar, once at her apron, once at her chapped hands, and back at her face, and the storm-gray eyes narrowed a fraction, and a small, weary, entirely mistaken warmth came into them. "Good," he said. "A sensible one. Fetch your mistress." Florentia set the needle down on the mended edge of the curtain and rose. The candle guttered as she crossed the hall, her half-boots striking the flagstones in a rhythm she had learned to make quiet years ago. Behind her, the creditor coughed into his fist and pretended not to look at the water stain climbing the wainscoting. She did not hurry. She had learned that too. At the great door she paused, one hand on the iron ring, and listened. Horses, 2 of them, wet from the rain, blowing hard. A carriage wheel groaning on the flooded track. She drew the shawl tighter and drew the bolt back. The wind pushed the door for her. 2 men stood on the top step in traveling cloaks black with water. The taller one had already lifted his gloved hand to knock again. He lowered it. He was tall. That was the first fact her mind offered her. 6 feet and something more. Broad through the shoulder, in the way of a man who had carried a pack over mountains and not forgotten how. Storm-gray eyes under a saber scar that cut clean through the right eyebrow. Dark hair cropped short in a soldier's fashion, silver already at the temples though he could not have been much past 34. An ink-dark tailcoat, water beading on the fine wool. A single heavy gold ring on the little finger of his left hand, and on that ring, the crest of Netherby. Her breath caught, then steadied. She did not curtsy. "Girl," he said. His voice was low, roughened by cold. "Take our cloaks. Tell your mistress the Duke of Netherby has arrived, and see to the horses before the boy loses them in the dark." The younger man behind him, slighter, softer about the mouth, the faded red of a demobbed infantry jacket showing under his cloak, made a small sound that might have been a laugh smothered in courtesy. Florentia did not move. "I am not a girl," she said, "and there is no mistress." The Duke's gaze sharpened. Rain ran off the brim of his hat and struck the stone at her feet. "Then who are you?" "Miss Florentia Sackville, ward to the late Duke. The steward is Mr. Coombs. He is in Newcastle until Friday. The stable boy is fetched from the village when needed and is not here tonight. Your horses will have to go into the west stable themselves. I will show you where." There was a small, still moment. The younger brother's smothered smile died. The Duke did not apologize. He did something better. He inclined his head, 1 precise degree, the way a soldier salutes an officer he had not known was on the field. "Miss Sackville, forgive the assumption." "It is a common one," she said. "The livery would help. There is none." She stood aside and let them in. Julius Wyndham followed his brother across the threshold with the wary, sideways step of a man used to floors that might not hold. His left hand kept close to his side. The right, she noticed, hung stiff at the wrist, as though it had been broken once and set by someone who did not much care. He caught her looking and gave her a rueful half-smile. "Salamanca," he said, "it aches in the wet." There is a fire in the library, she answered. The chapel roof lets in water. I would not put you there. This way. She led them down the long gallery. The portraits watched them pass. 5 generations of Netherby dukes, 3 of them with the saber scar of a younger son who had gone to war. She did not look at any of them. She had stopped looking at them the night she had stitched the black crepe over the 7th frame. Behind her, the Duke walked without sound. Julius made twice the noise of his brother and knew it. "You keep the house alone?" the Duke asked. "There is Mrs. Whitcomb in the kitchen. She is deaf in one ear and will not come up after dark. There is Peggy, who comes from the village 3 mornings a week to help with the linen when there is linen to help with. There is myself. That is the household of Netherby. And the tenants? 22 families, 4 of them behind on rent because I told them to be behind. The barley failed. If your Grace intends to press them tomorrow, I would ask your Grace to speak to me first." She said it evenly, without turning. She heard him stop for half a step, then continue. "I do not intend to press them tomorrow," he said. "Good." She opened the library door. The room was cold. She had let the fire fall low because coal was dear, and she had not expected callers. She knelt without ceremony, took the poker, and coaxed the embers up. Her chapped hands moved with the certainty of long practice. Neither man offered to help. The Duke, she thought, understood better than to insult her by trying. Julius simply stood by the hearth, easing the stiff hand toward the warmth. "There is bread," she said, standing. "There is cold beef. There is claret. The cellar is not yet sold. I will bring it. You will forgive the plate. Most of it went to the goldsmith in York last spring. Miss Sackville." She turned at the door. The Duke had removed his gloves. The signet ring caught the new firelight. His eyes were on her face, and there was something in them she did not know how to name. Not pity, which she would have refused. Not curiosity, which she would have ignored. Something more careful. Something that had already begun to weigh. "The solicitor from Lincoln's Inn is due within the hour," he said. "Mr. Hobhouse. He has ridden from London with the estate papers. I would ask you to be present when he reads them. I am not a party to the estate. You lived under my uncle's roof for 6 years. You are the last person in this house who spoke to him alive. You are a party." She held his gaze a moment longer than she would have thought possible. "Very well," she said. "I will bring 3 glasses." She closed the door behind her. In the passage, she leaned against the paneling, one hand flat to the wood, and let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. The iron key at her breast was warm from her skin. She pressed her palm over it through the russet wool. "When a worthy man knocks, open." The old Duke had said that on the last night. His voice had been thin as paper. She had not understood him then, and she did not understand him now, and yet she felt, quite absurdly, that she had just opened a door. She went to fetch the claret. Mr. Hobhouse of Lincoln's Inn arrived at 9:15, shaking the rain from a black oilskin and clutching a leather portfolio to his chest, as though it contained his own heart. He was a small, precise man with pouched eyes and a scholar's stoop. He bowed to the Duke, bowed a fraction less to Julius, and looked with visible confusion at Florentia when the Duke set a 4th chair to the fire and said, "Miss Sackville will remain." The solicitor did not argue. He had been the old Duke's man for 30 years, and he had learned early which battles a country solicitor might win. He set the portfolio on the small oak table, unbuckled the strap, and drew out a sheaf of papers tied with black tape. He removed his spectacles, wiped them on a handkerchief that had once been white, replaced them, and cleared his throat. "Your Grace," he began, "I would prefer to say what I must say in private. You will say it before all 3 of us. Your Grace, the matter is indelicate. Then it will improve for being aired. Read, Hobhouse." The solicitor's small hands trembled once. He mastered them. "The late Duke's personal debts at the time of his death," he said, "as recorded in the ledger of Netherby, amount to £2,440, 10 shillings, owed variously to tradesmen in York, Newcastle, and Berwick. These are recoverable in the ordinary way." Florentia set the decanter down without pouring. "That is not the matter," the Duke said. "You would not have ridden from London for tradesmen." "No, Your Grace." Hobhouse turned a page. His voice thinned. "There is a further schedule. A schedule of promissory notes drawn by the late Duke against the estate over the last 11 years. consolidated in the hands of a single creditor, a gentleman of Manchester who has since removed to a house in Bloomsbury Square, one Mr. Cornelius Plumptre. Read the sum, Hobhouse. Your Grace. Read it. The solicitor's throat worked. He looked, once, at Florentia, as though asking permission she had no standing to give. Then he read, £47,000. Julius made a small sound and sat down. Florentia did not sit. She placed the decanter with great care on the tray. She had held such a decanter, she thought stupidly, at a supper for the Bishop of Durham in the year the old Duke had still laughed. It weighed the same tonight. 47,000, the Duke repeated. He did not raise his voice, she understood, only lowered. Yes, Your Grace. Against an estate that clears, what, 900 a year in a good season? 600, Your Grace, since the barley. And this Plumptre holds all of it. Every note, Your Grace, consolidated under a single deed of assignment, executed in July of the present year, 6 weeks before his late Grace's death. The Duke was very still. Florentia had seen a hawk stand like that on the roof of the Dovecote once, before it dropped. Go on, he said. There is more. You would not have shaded your voice on the last page for £47,000 alone. Hobhouse turned the last page. He did not look up. There is a bond of surety, Your Grace, executed at the same time. A cross-guarantee, should the principal debtor, that is, the estate, default upon the consolidated sum, the surety falls upon the person of the guarantor named therein. Whose name? Your brother, Your Grace, the Honorable Julius Wyndham. Julius's stiff right hand closed slowly on the arm of the chair. Explain, the Duke said. A warrant has already been sworn, Your Grace, in the Court of King's Bench. It has not yet been served, out of courtesy, but it is lodged. Should the sum not be discharged in full within 6 weeks from Michaelmas, the warrant will be executed. Your brother will be committed to the Marshalsea until such time as the debt is satisfied or he dies there, Julius said quietly. Yes, I know how it goes. The fire cracked. 6 weeks, the Duke said. 6 weeks, Your Grace, from Michaelmas last. 4 now remain, and some days. Nobody spoke. Florentia lifted the decanter after all. She poured, steadily, 3 glasses of the old Duke's claret. She set the first before Julius, who did not touch it. She set the second before the solicitor, who did. She set the third at the Duke's right hand. He did not look at the glass. He looked at her. You knew my uncle in the last year, he said. It was not a question. Did he speak of debts? He spoke of a gentleman from Manchester, she said, who wrote often, whose letters he burned. He said once that the man had a face like a wax fruit and a hand like a purse. Did he ever say the man's name? Plumptre, twice, once in anger, once at the end, when he was not himself. What did he say at the end? She hesitated. The iron key was warm. He said, when a worthy man knocks, open. He was looking at the door of the chapel. The Duke did not move, but something behind his eyes moved, and it was as though a wing had shifted somewhere in the dark of the room. Hobhouse, he said, without turning. Leave the papers. Take a bed. The east chamber is dry, I trust, Miss Sackville. It is dry. Go. The solicitor rose, bowed, and went. Julius rose after him, one hand pressed to the small of his back, where an old ball had lodged and never come out. Osmond, he said. Bed, Julius. Osmond. Bed. I will not lose you to a debtor's cell before I have lost the roof over my head. Bed. Julius went. The door closed. The Duke stood. He crossed to the window and drew the curtain a hand's breadth aside. Rain was still falling on the courtyard where he had left his horses to a woman who did not curtsy. Miss Sackville, Your Grace, would you tell me plainly, is this house solvent for another month? Another month? Yes. Another 3? No. And the tenants? If we press them, they will go on the parish. If we do not press them, we starve here first. I have been choosing between the two since April. Which have you chosen? To starve first. He let the curtain fall. I am going to ask you something, he said, that I have no right to ask a lady I met at the door of my own house 1 hour ago. I am going to ask you to stay. Not as a ward, as a member of this household, in fact. I will need someone in these walls who knows what my uncle spoke and what he did not, what he burned and what he kept. who came to the door and who did not. I will need eyes that were here. I have 4 weeks and some days to save my brother from a cell, and this name from a paragraph in the Morning Post. I cannot do it blind." She did not answer at once. She looked at the fire she had built up with her own chapped hands, and at the ring on his little finger, and at the door beyond which Mr. Hobhouse of Lincoln's Inn was climbing the stairs to a room she had aired herself only that morning without knowing why. "You do not need to ask me to stay, Your Grace," she said. "I have nowhere to go. That is not the same as consenting." She looked at him then, properly, for the first time. "I consent," she said, "on one condition." "Name it." "You will not treat me as a girl again." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the shape a smile might take in a man who had forgotten the habit. "Miss Sackville," he said, "I do not believe I could, now, if I tried." She inclined her head one precise degree, the way a soldier salutes an officer whose field she has just walked onto. Then she went to the door, because there were still linens to air in the west stable for 2 traveling horses that no boy had come to see to, and because she had learned, long ago, that the surest way to hold a house together was to keep moving through it while it fell. At the threshold she paused. "Your Grace, Miss Sackville, the gentleman from Manchester, Mr. Plumptre." Did the deed of assignment specify, in the fine hand, whom he had appointed as his agent in the north? The Duke lifted the top paper from Hobhouse's sheaf. His storm-gray eyes moved down the column. They stopped. "The Reverend Ambrose Farley," he said, "vicar of this parish, your chaplain." Florentia laid her hand flat against the doorframe. "Then he already has a man inside these walls," she said, "and he has had since before your uncle died." She closed the door behind her before the Duke could answer, and went down the passage in the dark with the iron key warm at her breast and, for the first time in a year, a use for the Latin no one knew she had. The passage smelled of damp lime and old wax, and Florentia walked it faster than a woman with a warm iron key at her breast ought to walk. Behind her, the study door remained closed. Ahead, the wick of her tallow candle bent under a draught that had no business being in a corridor with no windows. She reached the north stair, set her hand on the banister, and stopped only long enough to promise herself that whatever the Duke of Netherby chose to make of a poor cousin who read Latin, she would not be the one to explain it first. By morning she had been given a title. Osmond found her in the small library at 7:30, before the maids had swept the hearth, with a thin volume of Ovid open across her knees and a piece of dry bread untouched on the arm of the chair. He did not apologize for entering. He set a cup of black coffee on the sill beside her and remained standing. "You will be my librarian," he said. "Resident, paid. I require a full accounting of my uncle's last 2 years, in his hand, from every book and ledger and scrap in this house. You will begin today." She closed the Ovid on her finger to keep the place. "I am not a servant to be assigned a room." "I am not assigning you a room. I am asking you to keep the one you have and to work in the muniment room, where the fire will be lit for you." He paused. "And to eat, Miss Sackville. My cook has orders." The tallow of last night was gone from his cravat. He had shaved. The scar above the right eyebrow was pinker in daylight. She looked at the coffee. She looked at him. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks, he agreed. Her mesura was a fraction of an inch. It was, she knew, the first she had given to any man in that castle for over a year. Within 3 days, the muniment room had become a room she recognized. She had it swept, the shutters oiled so they would close, a low table brought in, and the great oak chest dragged from the alcove into the center of the floor where the light from the north window would reach it. She wore an ink guard over her left cuff and pinned her sleeves back with 2 brass tacks stolen from the stable. She would not ruin the russet gown. It was the only one she had. Osmond came in on the 4th morning without knocking and found her on her knees. "That is the wrong posture for a librarian," he said. "It is the correct posture for the bottom of a chest," she answered, without lifting her head. "Your uncle kept his true books beneath his household ledgers. My father did the same. I suspect it is a Sackville habit." He crossed to her, careful of the papers spread in a fan across the floor, and lowered himself onto one knee beside her. The signet ring caught the light as his hand settled on the rim of the chest. She was aware, quite suddenly, of how much room a man of his size took up when he chose to be still. What are these? He asked. Accounts for a paint mill, she said. In the West Tower. He rebuilt it 4 years ago. He was making his own pigments. She lifted a slim brown volume with a broken clasp. And this is a journal, in Latin, from the last spring. He looked at the journal. He looked at her. The stubble at his jaw had begun to grow back. Read me a paragraph. She turned to the first page, marked with a bent corner, cleared her throat once, and read. Her Latin was not the Latin of a schoolboy. It was the Latin of a woman who had first heard it at her mother's knee, then read it aloud on winter afternoons to a dying uncle who had grown too tired to hold the book. She read without hurry, in a voice that neither performed nor apologized, and she did not stop to translate. She read as though the language belonged to her. He listened. When she reached the end of the paragraph, she closed the book on her finger and waited. Translate, he said. On the 14th of April, I dismissed the London apothecary. The samples he brought were not lead white, but the compound Plumpter's man promised, colored and waited to pass. I shall grind my own from Cornish ore. She lifted her eyes. Your uncle knew, Your Grace, that someone was selling him poisoned paint. Osmond did not move. The line of his mouth did what it always did, before he made a decision he did not wish to make. Then quietly, who is Plumpter's man? He does not name him here. And Plumpter? He does not name him either. Only twice, and each time with a particular contempt for the way the man signs his letters. She almost smiled. She stopped herself. He calls him homunculus fucatus, which is a dyed little man. Osmond's breath left him in something not quite a laugh. I will need every page of that journal in English by the end of the week, and I will need it in your hand, not a scribe's. Can you do it? Yes. You are certain? Your Grace, she said, and this time she did meet his eyes. I have been reading Latin in this house since before you knew the house existed. I am certain. He nodded once. He rose. At the door he stopped. There is a tower, he said. You mentioned a paint mill. There is. Show me. She took him up by the servant's stair because the main stair was rotten on the second landing. The Duke made no remark on the rot. He kept a hand near her elbow on the tight turns and did not touch her. At the top of the west tower she pushed open a door that had once been painted green and now was the color of nothing. The room beyond smelled of linseed and something metallic, sweetish, that caught at the back of the throat. Slabs of gray Cornish ore sat on a low bench beside a marble muller. A row of small stoppered pots, labeled in an old man's careful hand, ran along the sill. Ceruse, Naples, vermilion. 2 of the pots had been broken. The pigment lay in a chalky spill on the floor, tracked into a footprint that was neither the old Duke's nor Florentia's. Osmond crouched by the footprint. He measured it against his own boot. It was smaller, not a woman's, a short man's. When were you last in this room? He asked. June? I locked it in June, after the funeral. No one has the key but me. Then someone came in through the roof. She looked up. High on the north wall, a slate had been lifted and not properly replaced. Rain had come in. Rain had, in fact, been coming in for some months. He straightened. Miss Sackville, if your uncle was murdered by the man who is now demanding £47,000 of me, I will need to prove it. Not suspect it. Prove it. Will you help me? I have been helping you since the moment you arrived, she said, and calling it dusting. This time he did laugh. A short, surprised sound, as if he had forgotten he could. It cost him something, she thought, and then she chose not to look at his face while he recovered from it. They worked through the following week in a rhythm neither of them named. She kept the muniment room, he kept the study. Each morning she carried down a folded sheet of translation, set it on his desk without a word, and returned upstairs. Each afternoon he came up with 2 questions written in pencil on the margin, sat on the corner of her table, and waited while she answered them. He never sat in the chair. The chair, he seemed to have decided, was hers. Julius came and went. He rode into the village to buy time from a butcher. He rode back with a black eye and an apology. He watched his brother watch the librarian and said nothing at supper, which was, for Julius, an act of enormous restraint. On the 9th night she came down after the household had gone to bed, because she had found something and could not sleep with the finding. The study door was ajar. Osmond sat at the desk in shirt sleeves, coat over the back of the chair, saber scar catching the low candle. He had been writing to his solicitor in London. He set down the pen when she entered. "You are still awake," he said. "So are you." She placed the small brown journal on the desk between them, open at a page she had marked with a thread. "Read the last entry." He drew the candle closer. The entry was 3 lines only. It was dated the 28th of September, 6 days before the old Duke's death. It was not in Latin. It was in a shaking English hand. "If I do not survive the week, tell my heir that the true papers lie beneath the chapel, and that the girl in the russet gown reads Latin. She has the key. She has always had the key. She is the last honest thing in this house." Osmond read it twice. He did not look up when he asked, "You have the key?" "I have the key." "Since when?" "Since the night before he died. He put it into my hand and closed my fingers over it, and told me that when a man of dignity came knocking, I was to open." She paused. "I did not know, Your Grace, whether you would be that man. I know now that I do not know that yet, but I know that you are the only man who has come knocking." He did not ask to see the key. He did not reach for her hand. He rose, crossed to the window, and stood for a long minute with his back to the room, looking out at the black shape of the chapel across the courtyard. When he turned, his voice was the voice of a man who had been a colonel of hussars and not yet a duke. "We do not open it tonight. No. Plumptre will be watching the house within the week, if he has not begun already. He will expect us to move at once. We will not move at once. We will move when I have Lady Cust in London on our side, and Julius out of reach of any warrant. Can you carry that key another fortnight? I have carried it a year. So you have." He came back to the desk. He did not sit. He stood on the other side of it, and for the first time since he had walked into her hall and called her the housekeeper, he looked at her without any of the courteous distance a duke owed a poor cousin. "Miss Sackville," he said, "when I first saw you at that door, I thought you were a woman my uncle had reduced to service. I was wrong. You are the woman he trusted with everything he could not say aloud. I owe you an apology. I offer it now." She held very still. Her chapped hands were folded in front of the ink guard. She was aware that if she spoke too quickly she would ruin what he had given her. "Your Grace," she said at last, "I do not require an apology. I require that we do this properly." "Then we shall do it properly." "Then good night." "Good night, Miss Sackville." She went out. She closed the door. She stood for a moment in the passage with her hand flat against the wood, and only then did she permit herself, in the dark, the smallest exhale of a woman who had, at 22, been seen for the first time in a year. The next morning she came down in the same russet gown, but she had washed the collar, and the plain bone button at her throat had been polished with a scrap of chamois until it caught the light. Osmond noticed it. He said nothing. He set a second cup of black coffee beside the first on the sill of the small library, and left before she came in. By the end of the second week, the muniment room held more of Netherby's true history than the muniment room in London. She had reconstructed the paint mill's accounts back to 1815. She had traced 3 separate purchases of Cornish ore, paid for by the old Duke himself, and 1 shipment of London-made ceruse, invoiced from a Manchester warehouse, which the Duke had refused on delivery, and which had nonetheless been entered into the household ledger by a hand that was not his. She had underlined the hand 3 times. She would know it again in any room in England. She worked past the dinner hour that night without noticing the dinner hour had passed. When Osmond came to fetch her, he brought a plate himself, cold pheasant, bread that was, for once, not stale, a single pear. "You will not translate a poisoning on an empty stomach," he said, and set the plate at her elbow. "I have translated worse on less. I do not doubt it. Eat." She ate. He stood at the window with his back to her, hands loose behind him, the signet ring turning slowly on his little finger. He was thinking. She could hear him thinking. It was, she found, a companionable noise. "Miss Sackville," he said at last. "The Manchester warehouse. Do you have the address?" "Turner Street, number 19. The invoice is on the 2nd page. And the hand that entered it in the ledger. You are sure it is the same hand that signs the promissory notes?" She rose, wiped her fingers on the ink guard, and brought both papers to the window. She laid the invoice against the note. She held them to the light. The signet ring on his little finger caught the flame of the candle as he leaned in beside her. "The T," she said. "Look at the T, and the descender of the P in Plumptre's clerk. He cannot help himself. He curls it back on the second stroke. It is a vanity. He does it on every document that ever passed through his desk. You have seen his desk? I have seen 4 of his letters. My uncle kept them all. They are in the alcove behind the chest, wrapped in oilcloth. I have not shown them to you yet because I wished to be certain of the hand before I did. She looked up. I am certain of the hand. Osmond did not speak for a long moment. He looked at her, at the papers, at the ring on his own finger, and then again at her. He had, she thought, the expression of a man who had begun a campaign, expecting to lose it, and had just been handed a map. You will come with me to London on Thursday, he said. Not as my librarian, as my cousin. Lady Cust will receive us together. You will bring the ledger, the invoice, the letters, and the journal. You will not bring the key. The key remains here, where it has always been, until we know precisely which door it opens. I know which door it opens. He looked at her. The coffer in the crypt, she said, beneath the chapel. The inscription over the door is in Latin. It is a line from Cicero. He that seeks the truth must first be worthy of it. She paused. I have been worthy of it, Your Grace, for a year. I was simply waiting for a second worthy man. Osmond set the papers down on the sill with a care that was not quite steady. Then let us earn the second half of that inscription, he said, before we open the door. She was underlining the clerk's curling P a 4th time when Osmond came in the following morning with a fresh letter open in his fist and his face the color of the paper. Lady Cust writes from Grosvenor Square, he said. She will receive us on Thursday. She says, and I quote her exactly, Miss Sackville, because I want you to hear it in her words. She says, "Bring the girl who reads Latin. I have been waiting for her since her mother died." Florentia set down her pen with the greatest care she had ever used. My mother, she said, died when I was 9. Then Lady Cust has been waiting 13 years. She looked at the underlined ledger. She looked at the door. She looked, at last, at the Duke of Netherby, who was watching her as a man watches a candle. He has decided, against all sense, to trust with a long, dark passage. She did not smile, but she inclined her head, in a misura that lasted a fraction of a second longer than the one she had given him a fortnight before, and she said, in the voice of a woman who had begun to understand what she was worth, "Then we must not keep her waiting any longer." The carriage jolted onto the London road before dawn, and Florentia kept her gloved hands folded over the small leather satchel in her lap, as though it contained gunpowder. In a sense, it did. Inside lay 3 of the old Duke's ledgers, a bundle of household receipts tied with butcher's twine, and a slim black notebook, whose Latin marginalia she had begun to translate the night before, by the light of a single tallow stub. She had not slept. She was not tired. Fatigue, she had learned in 7 years of remending curtains at midnight, was a country one could refuse to visit if one had somewhere else to be. Across from her, the Duke of Netherby watched the frozen hedgerows slide past the window. He had not spoken in nearly an hour. The pale saber scar above his right eyebrow caught the gray light and paled further. His gloved hand rested on the seat beside him, the heavy gold signet ring turned inward, as though he did not wish the Netherby crest to be seen even by the empty fields. "You have not asked me why we are going," he said at last. "I assumed you would tell me when it served you to. It serves me now." She lifted her eyes, storm gray, hers hazel green, the space between them the width of a well-kept secret. "Lady Cust has sent for me," he said. "The Dowager Countess. She writes that she has learned something concerning my brother's warrant, which she will not commit to paper. She asks that I bring the ledgers. She asks that I bring you." "Me." She was quite particular. Florentia inclined her head a fraction. She did not ask how a woman she had never met had come to know her name. In houses like Netherby, in seasons like this, names traveled faster than carriages. They reached Grosvenor Square in a thin January rain. The Cust townhouse rose behind black railings, the stone freshly scrubbed, the brass knocker gleaming, every inch of it a quiet reproach to the decay Florentia had left behind. She stepped down from the carriage, felt the heavy iron key shift against her corset beneath the borrowed pelisse, and steadied her breath. The leather cord around her neck had chafed her skin raw over the past fortnight. She had begun to think of the chafing as a promise she was keeping. They were shown into a small blue drawing room where a fire burned too hot for the hour. Lady Cust rose from a high-backed chair with the aid of an ebony cane crowned by a silver knob. Thin, upright, 67, white hair coiled high beneath a cap of black lace. The dark crescent birthmark on her left jaw moved when she spoke, as though it too were listening. Netherby, she offered him her gloved hand and studied his face without softening. You have your father's mouth. A pity. He used it badly. Madam. Her piercing blue eyes turned upon Florentia and stopped there. And you must be the Sackville girl. Come nearer, child. My sight is not what it was, and I intend to know you before I ruin a man on your behalf. Florentia crossed the carpet. She did not curtsy deeper than her station allowed. She had done enough excessive curtsying in her 7 years to last a lifetime. Hazel eyes, said Lady Cust. Your mother's. She was clever, and it did her no good, but perhaps the world has changed a little since then. Sit. They sat. The dowager rapped the cane once against the floor, and a manservant deposited a flat mahogany box on the low table between them. Lady Cust did not open it at once. She looked at Osmond instead, and her voice, when she spoke, had gone very quiet. How much do you owe, Netherby? 47,000 pounds, held entirely by one Cornelius Plumptre, of Threadneedle Street. And how much of it did your father truly borrow? Osmond's jaw tightened. That is the question I came to London to answer. Then let me answer it for you. Lady Cust unlatched the box. Within lay a stack of paper, half a dozen promissory notes, brittle at the edges, the ink upon them a deep sepia brown. She lifted the topmost note between two thin fingers and held it toward the window so that the pale January light passed through the sheet. Look. Osmond rose and stepped to her side. Florentia rose also, more slowly, and came to stand at his shoulder. Do you see the watermark? Said Lady Cust. Faint in the paper, like a bruise beneath skin, was a stylized swan with a crown above its head. A Manchester mill, said the dowager. Belknap and Sons. They did not begin pressing this pattern into their paper until the spring of 1817. Osmond did not move. Your father signed this note, she went on, in the year of our Lord 1806. 11 years, Netherby, before the paper it is written upon existed. Silence. Florentia felt something shift very quietly beneath her sternum, as though a bone had been set that she had not known was broken. It is forged, she said. All of them. Lady Cust laid the notes down. I have had them examined by a papermaker in Spitalfields, who owed me a favor older than your brother. Every single note in Plumptre's possession bears a watermark from a mill that did not exist when your father is said to have signed. They are not debts, Netherby. They are lies pressed onto lies, and they have been passed through the courts by a man who counted on no one caring enough to hold the paper up to the light. Osmond did not sit. He walked to the window and stood with his back to them, one hand braced against the frame. The signet ring caught the light. Florentia watched the muscle at the base of his jaw work once, twice, and go still. Julius, he said. Marshalsea will not hold him if the notes are dust. Lady Cust folded her hands over the silver knob of her cane. But dust is a slow thing, Netherby. Chancery is slower. Plumptre has friends in the ton, and the ton has a nose for weakness. If you march into the courts tomorrow shouting forgery, he will call you a bankrupt with a grievance, and half of London will believe him before breakfast. Then what would you have me do? Bleed him quietly. Assemble your proofs. Every note, every ledger, every witness. And then, when the room is full, and the wine is poured, and the man himself is smiling at a duchess, you set the whole of it down before the correct pair of hands. Not the courts, not yet. The Bank of England, the Attorney General, a public room, a witnessed hour. You do not sue him, Netherby. You unmake him. Osmond turned from the window. In how long? You have 5 weeks until the winter ball at Grosvenor. I have secured you an invitation. Plumptre has bought his. Florentia had not spoken. Now she did. Then we have 5 weeks to find the rest. Lady Cust's blue eyes moved to her and narrowed with an interest that had not been there before. The rest, child? He did not stop at forged paper. Florentia's voice was even. A man who murders a duke by his signature does not murder him only there. There will be more. There will be receipts he did not think to burn. The dowager was silent for a long moment. Then she gave a single small nod, as of one veteran acknowledging another. You will do, she said. Netherby, I like her. Do not lose her. They dined in Half Moon Street, at a small chop house where the Duke was not known, and did not speak of Plumptre once. Florentia ate very little. She had ordered a plain broth and a slice of dark bread, and she cut the bread into small, precise squares, as though each square were a task she could complete. Osmond watched her hands and did not comment. "You did not flinch," he said at last. "At what?" "At any of it." She set down her knife. "My lord, I have lived in that castle for 7 years. I have watched the drawing-room wallpaper rot from behind. I have counted candle stubs. I have sold 2 of my mother's brooches to pay a farrier. When Lady Cust held that paper to the window, I did not flinch, because I have been waiting, without knowing it, to be told that the thing which broke us was not our shame. It was a man's hand." "A man," he said, "who will pay for it." "Yes, I will see to that. We will see to that." He did not correct her. They returned to the Cust townhouse near dusk. Lady Cust had insisted they take her guest rooms rather than an inn, and Florentia found herself installed in a chamber whose curtains alone would have paid 3/4 at Netherby. She stood before the small writing desk for a long time. Then she unpinned the leather cord from beneath her collar and drew the iron key up over her head. It was heavier than a key ought to have been, nearly the length of her hand, dark with age, its bit cut in a pattern she had never seen upon any lock at Netherby. 3 teeth long, 1 short, 1 long again. She had worn it against her skin every day for 4 months. It had left a faint bruise between her collarbones that had never quite faded. She was going down the stairs before she had decided to go. She found him in the small library, in shirt sleeves, the tailcoat abandoned across the arm of a chair. He had a ledger open on the desk before him, and was making notes in a hand that was smaller and neater than she had expected. The lamplight caught the silver at his temples. He rose when she entered. "Miss Sackville, please sit. What I have to give you does not require ceremony." He sat. She crossed the carpet and stopped at the edge of the desk. She laid the iron key upon the ledger, between his hand and the inkpot, without a word. He looked at it. He did not touch it. "He gave it to me," she said. "Your uncle. The evening before he died, he had sent the household to bed. He came down to the still room where I was pressing quinces because it was the only warm chamber left in the west wing. He put this into my palm and he closed my fingers around it, and he said, 'I remember every syllable because I have said them over to myself every night for 2 years. He said, "Florentia, when a man of honor comes knocking, open." He did not tell me what it opened. He did not tell me who the man would be. I asked. He only smiled and said, "You will know him because he will look at you as though you are the room, not the furniture in it." Osmond did not move. "I have carried it," she said, "against my heart, since the morning they buried him, through Plumptre's visits, through the credit men, through winters when I would have sold my hair for a scuttle of coal, and never once did I think to sell this, because I did not know what it was. Only that he trusted me with it, only that he told me I would know." Her voice did not tremble, her hands did not tremble. The iron on the ledger caught a slow gleam from the lamp. "You look at me," she said, "as though I am the room." He picked up the key. His fingers closed around it, and she saw, in the working of his jaw, the flicker of a thing that had nothing to do with dukedoms or debts. He lifted his eyes to her, storm-gray and quite still, and for a long moment he did not speak, because there were no words in the king's English that would have done. "Miss Sackville," he said finally, and his voice had gone low, "do you know what this is?" "No. It is the key to the crypt coffer, the vault beneath the chapel, beneath the Latin inscription upon the door which I could not read, and which you translated in the 2nd week without lifting your eyes from your mending. He had it cut in Bruges the year I was born. There is one other in existence, and it hung around my father's neck when he died at Salamanca, and it is buried with him." She said nothing. "He gave you," Osmond said, very quietly, "the only remaining key to every secret my house has ever hidden. And he told a girl of 20 to keep it against her skin until a man of honor came knocking. Yes, Miss Sackville, Florentia." It was the first time he had used her Christian name. The syllables sat in the room like a thing set down carefully. "He was preparing you," he said, "to save us, before I knew we needed saving." She held her ground because her knees would not permit anything else. "Then let us not waste his preparation," she said. Osmond rose. He held the iron key in his palm as though weighing more than metal. Then, slowly, he passed the leather cord back to her and held out the key upon its length. No, he said. Keep it, until the hour we open the door together. You have earned every night of that wearing, and I will not take it off you now, 3 weeks before the end. She bent her head. She lifted the cord back over her hair and settled the iron once more against her sternum, upon the bruise it had already made, and she felt, for the first time in 7 years, that the weight upon her chest was not a burden but a commission. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks. We ride for Netherby at dawn. There are ledgers I will not trust to any hand but ours, and there is a still room I have not yet seen in daylight, and a toriau, whose paints I now believe I must examine before another candle is lit above them. You suspect. I suspect, he said, that Lady Cust was right. A man who forges a duke's signature does not stop at ink. She met his eyes. Nor at ink, she said, does a man stop at murder. The lamp between them guttered once, caught, and burned steady. They stood a moment longer, the iron key between them without being between them any longer, and then Florentia inclined her head. The same fraction of a second's added mesura she had begun to give him upon the stair a fortnight before, and went from the room without permission and without apology, because she no longer required either. Behind her, in the small library on Grosvenor Square, the Duke of Netherby sat down again at the ledger, and turned, very slowly, the heavy gold signet ring upon his little finger, until the Netherby crest faced outward once more. He dipped the pen. He wrote 3 lines in his small, neat hand. Then he set the pen down and, for the first time since his uncle's death, he permitted himself the smallest of smiles, not for the dowager, not for the debts, not for the brother in Marshalsea, but for a young woman who had walked into a lamplit room carrying a piece of iron and had laid it upon his ledger as though laying down a sword she had never intended to surrender to any lesser man. Outside the window, the rain over Grosvenor turned quietly to snow. Somewhere across the city, in a tobacco-brown coat too heavy for the season, Cornelius Plumptre was raising a glass of claret to a magistrate's daughter and laughing at his own wit. And he did not know, he could not know, that a mill in Manchester had begun, 11 years too soon, to press swans into paper, and that a girl he had once ordered to fetch him tea had just handed the only key that mattered to the only man in England who would use it against him. The carriage was called for 4 in the morning. Florentia did not sleep. She sat at the small writing desk in the guest room and, by the light of a single steady candle, began to copy out, line by careful line, in her clear convent hand, every Latin marginal note she had ever committed to memory from the old Duke's diary. If murder had been done at Netherby, it had been done in a language only 3 people in the household had ever read. 2 of them were dead. She meant to survive long enough to be the 3rd. At dawn, the coach horses stamped in Grosvenor Square. Osmond handed her up into the carriage himself, and as the door closed, she felt the iron key settle once more against her heart with the particular gravity of a thing that had, at last, been recognized for what it was. She looked across at the Duke of Netherby in the pale winter light, and she understood, with a clarity that neither of them yet dared to name, that they were no longer riding north to save a house. They were riding north to open a door. The morning post reached Netherby before the frost had lifted from the eastern lawns. A boy from the village brought it, cheeks scarlet, holding the folded paper away from his coat as if it might bite. Florentia took it at the servant's door, still in her russet gown, the iron key warm against her ribs beneath the linen. She read the column standing in the passage. A certain northern duke, lately returned from the peninsula, is said to have taken uncommon interest in a female relation of humble station now residing under his roof. Charity, one hopes, is the only ledger being settled. The words were arranged with a jeweler's care. No name. No accusation that a solicitor could pin. Only the shape of ruin. She folded the paper twice and walked to the library. Osmond was already there, coat off, sleeves pushed to the elbow, bent over a Manchester paper mill invoice Lady Cust had sent by express 2 days before. He looked up. He saw her face before he saw the paper. "Read it," she said. He read it once. He read it twice. The muscle at his jaw set. He did not curse. He did not rise. He folded the sheet along her creases and laid it upon the desk with the same care a surgeon lays down a blade. "Plumptre," he said. "Plumptre," she agreed. Outside, a rook shouted from the yew walk. Inside, the fire popped once and settled. He will not stop here, Osmond said. He has spent too much on the printers not to spend more. Then let him spend. Osmond looked at her. In the gray morning light, the hazel of her eyes had turned nearly green. He had learned, in the past 3 weeks, to read that particular shade the way another man read a barometer. You are not frightened. I am furious, she said. There is a difference. A boot rang on the flags of the corridor. The under-butler, Pettigrew, came in white-faced, hat in hand, out of breath. Your Grace, a writer from London, Master Julius. Osmond was on his feet before the sentence closed. Speak. Taken up, Your Grace. This dawn, on the writ of one Cornelius Plumptre, gentleman of Threadneedle Street, Marshalsea Prison, Your Grace. He is committed to the Marshalsea. Florentia set her hand flat upon the desk. She did not know she had done it until she felt the wood beneath her palm and the paper beneath her thumb. Osmond did not speak for a full breath. Then he moved. He crossed to the sideboard, poured no brandy, took no coat, and said only, Have my chestnut saddled. Have the second horse for Pettigrew. We ride within the quarter hour. You cannot ride to Marshalsea today, Florentia said quietly. He turned on her, and for a heartbeat she saw the man who had ridden at Salamanca, the man whose orders had killed and saved in the same breath. He is my brother. He is your brother, and he will still be your brother at nightfall, she said. Plumptre wants you on the London road, in a temper, without a plan. He wants you to arrive in the yard of the Marshalsea, shouting his name in front of witnesses he has already paid. That is the paragraph he prints tomorrow. Osmond stopped. His hand closed on the back of the chair. She watched the knuckles whiten and then, slowly, ease. What would you have me do? Send Pettigrew to Lady Cust, with the Manchester invoice and my note. She has a nephew in the House of Commons who owes her a favour older than my father's death. He will see Julius fed and warm within the day. Then we ride, not to London, to the crypt. He looked at her a long moment. The chapel. The chapel. He did not ask how she knew. He had learned, also, not to ask. 200 miles to the south, at that hour, the drawing rooms of Mayfair were already at their work. The Morning Post lay open upon a dozen breakfast tables and half a dozen pier glasses. Lady Marchmont read the column aloud to her daughters between spoonfuls of chocolate and laughed until the pearls at her throat shook. The Duchess of Farringdon, who had once been slighted at a Bath assembly by the late Duke of Netherby, permitted herself a smile so small it might have been mistaken for indigestion. In the bay window of White's a young viscount wagered 10 guineas that Netherby would be in the fleet before Christmas. The wager was taken within the minute. None of them had ever seen Florentia Sackville. None of them needed to. The ton did not require a face to bury a name. At the Marshalsea, at that same hour, Julius Wyndham sat upon a plank bed in a room shared with 3 debtors and a consumptive attorney's clerk, staring at his stiff right hand and trying to remember which of his brother's letters he had answered and which he had not. A turnkey brought bread. He did not eat it. At Netherby, Pettigrew was dispatched within the quarter hour, an oilcloth satchel across his back, and Lady Cust's town address memorized twice over. Florentia went to write 2 lines to the Dowager Countess at the library desk, while Osmond gave orders in the yard. The pen moved without tremor. She sealed the note with a plain wafer. She did not use the Netherby crest. She was climbing the tower stair to fetch her shawl when she heard hooves. Not 1 horse. 4. She reached the arrow slit above the gatehouse and looked down. 4 men on hired hacks. Town coats too fine for the road. One of them she knew by the round rimless spectacles catching the morning even at 50 yards. No, not Plumptre himself. Plumptre would never leave the city. His clerk and 3 thief-takers with the yellow armbands of the sheriff's office. They carried a warrant. She descended the stair at a run that would have set any dowager weeping, and reached the great hall as the knocker fell. Osmond was already there. He had heard the horses too. His coat was on. His face was the face of Salamanca. They will have a warrant to search, she said, low and fast. Plumptre will say the estate books are being concealed. He wants the true testament. He wants the crypt key. You have it. I have it. Give it to me. I will— No, she caught his sleeve. If it is upon you when they search, we are undone. I know this house. I know where I can put it that no man of Threadneedle Street will look. Florentia, open the door, Your Grace, or they will break it. He opened the door. The clerk came in first, hat in hand, all civility. He had a paper. He read the paper. Search of premises for concealed documents pertaining to the estate of the late Duke of Netherby, signed by a magistrate whose name Osmond knew and whose gambling debts to plumptre Lady Cust had already catalogued in a Manchester envelope. By all means, Osmond said. The house is open. My steward will accompany you. Florentia had already turned toward the servants' passage. She walked, not ran. She passed the still room. She passed the pantry. She entered the old dairy, cold, disused, the shelves furred with dust, and drew the leather cord from her neck. The key was heavier than any object of its size had a right to be. Iron, dark, cold even against a warm palm. She heard boots in the corridor behind her. 2 sets, coming fast. She looked at the shelves, the rafters, the empty butter churn. None of it would do. A trained searcher would find any of them in a minute. The boots were at the door. She put the key in her mouth. It tasted of iron and old oil, and the faint dry salt of her own skin. It filled the hollow behind her lower teeth. She pressed her tongue against it. She closed her lips. The door opened. A thief-taker stood there, thick-necked, ruddy, a truncheon at his belt. "Miss, step out." She stepped out. She kept her head lowered as a housemaid should. She did not speak. A woman who does not speak cannot be caught in a lie. He looked at her. He looked past her, into the dairy, and his eyes went where searchers' eyes go, up, along the beams, into the corners. He grunted. He shouldered past her. She walked, slow, back along the passage. Every step of the iron in her mouth was an act of will. She did not swallow. She did not breathe through her nose too loudly. She reached the great hall. Osmond was standing by the cold hearth. His eyes found her at once. His eyes asked. Her eyes answered. The clerk was in the library. She heard drawers being drawn. She heard the small dry sound of ledgers being lifted and dropped. She walked past Osmond without stopping. She went into the small parlor, where no one had sat for a decade, and stood in the window bay with her back to the room. They began in the library. Books came off shelves in dry avalanches. The clerk turned the leaves of the great estate ledger with a thumb licked twice a page, and Osmond watched him from the doorway with the patience of a man who has decided, at last, precisely how a thing shall end. They moved to the muniment room. They opened chests that had not been opened since her father's death. They tapped the paneling with the pommels of their canes and listened for hollows. They found 3 hollows. 2 contained mouse nests. The third contained a bundle of love letters written in 1789 by the late Duke to a girl who had married a Norfolk squire. The clerk looked at the seal, sniffed, and put them back. They climbed to the tower. Florentia heard their boots upon the stair where, 10 days before, she had shown Osmond the atelier of lead paints. She heard a jar lifted, sniffed, set down. She heard the clerk say, at the top of the stair, "Nothing of significance." He was not a good enough liar to keep the disappointment out of it. All told, the search took 2 hours. At the end of it, the clerk emerged, dust upon his cuffs, and read a list of nothing found. He asked to speak with the person of Miss Sackville. She came into the hall. He looked her over with the polite contempt of a man who has been told what he will find. "You will forgive me, madam. My instructions are particular. Your person." Osmond's hand moved half an inch toward his coat. Florentia did not turn her head, but she felt it. "You will not lay a finger upon Miss Sackville," Osmond said, and the drawing-room voice was gone. In its place was the voice that had emptied a hillside in Portugal. The clerk paled a shade. "A female of the household. Mrs. Yardley," Florentia said, without moving her jaw more than she must. "The housekeeper. In the still room. She will attend me. Mrs. Yardley, 60, wide, and afraid of no man in London, came." She led Florentia into the still room and closed the door in the clerk's face and said, "Turn about, child." Florentia turned about. Mrs. Yardley did what she was required to do, briskly, in silence, hands moving through pockets and cuffs and hems with the impersonal thoroughness of a woman who had once dressed a duchess. She found nothing. She could not have found what she was not looking for. "Nothing on her person," Mrs. Yardley called through the door. The clerk received the report. He bowed. He requested as a courtesy to see the young lady's hands. She held them out. He looked at the chapped knuckles, the reddened wrists, and satisfied that these were not the hands of a woman who hid gold, thanked her. Then his eye caught something else. Not on the hand, on the shoulder. The seam of the russet gown, at the collar, where the linen inside had frayed and shone white. It had shown white because the leather cord, the one that had held the key against her breastbone for 6 years, had rubbed the lining raw, and the cord was gone. He looked at her throat. "Bear. Madam, your necklace." "I have none, sir." "You had one. There is the mark." He reached. Osmond crossed the hall in 3 strides. The truncheon at the thief-taker's belt came half out of its loop. Osmond's hand closed on the clerk's wrist and stopped it in the air, an inch from Florentia's collar. "You will not," Osmond said, "touch her." "Your Grace, the warrant." "The warrant permits search of premises. It does not permit assault upon a gentlewoman under my roof. Show me one line that says otherwise, and I will read it aloud in Westminster Hall on Monday morning." The clerk did not have such a line. He knew he did not. He also knew what he had seen. He looked from Osmond's face to Florentia's throat and back, and something small and mean tightened at the corner of his mouth. He stepped back. "Very well, Your Grace." He gave the housekeeper a last look. He tipped his hat to Florentia. Not a bow, a tip, and, with a small motion of one gloved hand, indicated to the thief-takers that they were done. They were not done. Florentia understood, with the same clarity with which she read Latin, that the man had already composed his report, and that his report would say the necklace had been hidden, and that the mistress of the house had refused a lawful search. The 4 men mounted in the yard. The clerk gathered his skirts of his coat. Then, as the horses turned, he glanced up at the small parlor window and, as if he had only just remembered a piece of business, spurred his mount hard against the flank of the ruddy thief-taker's horse. The thief-taker lurched. His arm swung out. The truncheon caught Florentia's sleeve as she stood in the doorway and tore it from shoulder to elbow in a single ragged line. He apologized, red as ham. The clerk apologized. They were, they said, so very sorry. Country horses, country grooms. The Duke would understand. Then they rode. Osmond stood in the yard until the last hoof was silent on the frozen road. Then he came inside. He did not speak. He closed the door. He drew the bolt. Florentia had already gone into the still room. She spat the key into her palm and washed it in the basin with hands that were not, she noted with detached surprise, trembling. She dried it on her apron. She threaded a new cord, plain kitchen twine, through the eye. Mrs. Yardley came in behind him without knocking, carrying a folded gown of dove-gray wool that had once belonged to a governess long since pensioned. She laid it upon the deal table and said, "You will not go down into that chapel in a torn sleeve, miss. Not tonight of all nights." Then she withdrew, and closed the door behind her, and stood in the passage with her arms folded, daring any thief-taker in England to come back through the yard. Osmond found her there. He did not look at the key. He looked at the torn sleeve. "I will kill him," he said quietly. "You will not," she said. "You will do better than that." She lifted her chin. In the small mirror above the basin she saw herself. The chapped hands, the ruined gown, the mark along her collarbone where a leather cord had lived for 6 years, and she saw, behind her, a duke standing very still with a face like winter. "I have already read the inscription on the lid of the coffer, Osmond," she said. "In the Latin your uncle taught me. I know what is inside. I have known for 6 years. Tonight, at midnight, we will go down and open it, and then Cornelius Plumptre will spend the rest of his life discovering that a country girl in a torn gown was the only ledger in England he could not cook." She turned from the mirror. She lifted the twine cord over her head and settled the key once more against her ribs. Osmond did not speak. He took her hand, the reddened, chapped, unfrightened hand, and lifted it, once, to his mouth. Outside, a second rider was already spurring south along the frozen road, with the clerk's report folded inside his coat, and by nightfall it would lie upon Cornelius Plumptre's desk in Threadneedle Street, and Cornelius Plumptre would smile and reach for his pen. He did not yet know that at that same hour, in a cold chapel under a ruined castle, a woman he had never troubled to look at twice was about to slide an iron key into a lock older than his name. The lantern trembled in Osmond's hand as they descended the worn stone steps beneath the chapel. Florentia went first, one shoulder brushing the damp wall, the iron key warm from her palm. Above them, the wind moved through the ruined nave like a slow breath. Below, the air grew colder, older, tasting of chalk and iron and something faintly sweet, like old paper long shut away. She stopped at the third landing. The vault door stood before them, oak banded with black iron, a Latin inscription cut deep into the lintel. Osmond raised the lantern. He read the words slowly, mouth working, the soldier in him refusing shortcuts. "Only the worthy," he said at last. "Only the worthy shall enter." "Close enough," Florentia answered. She slid the key into the lock. It caught. She turned it with both hands. The bolt gave a sound like a bone setting. Inside, the crypt was small and dry. A single wooden coffer sat on a low stone bench, unadorned but for the Netherby crest burned into the lid. Osmond set the lantern down. His hand hovered above the coffer as if the wood might bite. Then he opened it. The color left his face in one long draw, the way water leaves a shore. He lifted the topmost document first. It was heavy parchment, sealed and countersigned, and he read the first 3 lines before his shoulders dropped a full inch. "The true will," he said. His voice had gone flat. "No debts. Every acre unencumbered." Florentia said nothing. She was watching his hands. Beneath the will lay a bundle of promissory notes tied with faded pink tape. He cut the tape with the small knife at his belt. Each note bore the same trembling old signature of his father. Each note also bore, on the reverse, a receipt of full discharge, stamped and dated, in Cornelius Plumpter's own precise ink. Every debt the ton had shrieked about for a year had been paid off years before Osmond had ever set boot in Netherby. "He paid them," Osmond said. "He paid them and kept the notes. He kept them to sell again." "Read the letters," Florentia said quietly. There were 9 of them. They were in Plumpter's hand, addressed to a chemist in Manchester, ordering white lead in doses too small to be industrial and too regular to be innocent. There were replies in a coarser hand promising discretion. There was a bill from a printer for 200 sheets of aged parchment stock, watermarked to look like 1802. There was a note in Plumpter's writing, undated, that read simply, "The old fool grows suspicious of the wine. Move to the cordial." Osmond read that last line twice. Then he sat down on the stone bench very carefully, as if his knees had forgotten their business. "He was poisoned," he said. "For years," Florentia said, slowly enough to be called madness. Osmond closed his eyes. She saw the war come up behind his lids, and the ledger of every campaign he had ever survived, and the private hell of a son who had believed the worst of a father who had merely been dying under another man's hand. When he opened his eyes again, the soldier was back in them, and something colder besides. "He wrote to me twice that last year," Osmond said. "I did not answer. I thought him a drunk in mourning. I thought the letters proof of the ruin. He knew you would come in the end. He should not have had to know it." "No," she said. "He should not. And Plumpter wrote the madness into the papers while he wrote the poison into the bottle." "Yes." Osmond lifted his eyes to her. In the lantern light, his storm-gray eyes had gone almost black. The scar above the right eyebrow stood pale. "You knew," he said. "How long?" "I suspected the lead when I found the pigments in the North Tower. I was certain the night your solicitor read the debts aloud. I was afraid of being right. And you said nothing. I gave you the key." He held her look for a long moment. Then he looked back down at the coffer. There was one paper left, folded small, tied with a black thread. He opened it, and the last color that remained in him seemed to leave. "An annuity," he said, "in your name, 400 a year for life. Signed by my father the week before he died." Florentia's hand closed around the leather cord at her throat, where the key had lain so long. "He told me a worthy man would come," she said. "He did not say the man would be his son." Osmond stood. He gathered the papers with a soldier's economy, wrapped them in oiled cloth, and placed them back in the coffer. He locked it. He put the key in his own inner pocket now, over the heart, and did not ask her permission, and she did not require to be asked. At the top of the steps he paused. The wind had dropped. Somewhere across the frostbitten park, a single bell in the village was striking the small hours. "The winter ball is in 3 nights," he said. "I know. Lady Cust has already sent your gown. I know that also. Then you know what I mean to do." "I know exactly what you mean to do." He almost smiled. It did not quite reach his mouth, but it reached his eyes, and that was more. The 3 days that followed passed in a hush that only the very rich and the very ruined can manage together. Lady Cust arrived in her traveling coach at dawn on the first day and did not leave. She installed herself in the west drawing room and ran the household from a small mahogany desk with the air of a general who had been waiting years for the war to reach her. She spoke to no one of the coffer. She spoke to everyone of the ball. On the second day, the Attorney General's private secretary rode down from London under the pretext of shooting. He shot nothing. He left with a sealed packet inside his coat and a face that had aged 5 years between breakfast and luncheon. On the second evening, a locksmith arrived from Cheapside and worked 3 hours upon the great front door of the London house. When he left, the old wards had been retired and a new set fitted. Lady Cust had insisted upon it. "One does not," she had said, "invite an enemy into a house whose keys he may already own." Reverend Farley came down from Netherby on horseback in the same rain, his cassock heavier for it. He carried the parish register and a wrapped oilcloth under his arm. Certain baptisms, certain marriages, certain very old entries concerning Cornelius Plumpter's late brother-in-law would need to be produced in court, and the vicar's ink-stained fingers turned the pages himself before Lady Cust's mahogany desk. He would testify. He had waited, he said quietly, 40 years to be asked. On the third day, Julius was still in the Marshalsea. Osmond had chosen not to move him yet. Justice, Lady Cust had said dryly, tasted better when served in the correct order. The night of the ball arrived. Grosvenor Square glittered with the small, bright cruelty of London in winter. Lamps burned in every window of the great house on the north side, and a double line of carriages stretched back into Brook Street. Inside, the Tun had gathered, as the Tun always gathered when there was blood in the water, perfumed, powdered, and hungry. They had come to see the ruined Duke bring his ruined cousin, and to pity them both loudly before supper. The doors opened. A footman announced them. His Grace the Duke of Netherby, Miss Florentia Sackville. For 1 full second, the room went silent. Florentia stood at the top of the marble stair on Osmond's arm. She wore the claret silk Lady Cust had chosen, the empire waist skimming, the short puffed sleeves bearing shoulders that a year of chapel damp had not managed to spoil. Long cream kid gloves reached above the elbow. The inherited cameo brooch sat on her left shoulder like a small, pale eye. Her dark hair had been dressed low and simply, without ornament, which in that room of feathers and diamonds struck like a sword. Osmond wore ink-dark indigo black brocade waistcoat, plain linen cravat in the soldier's knot he never abandoned. On the little finger of his right hand, the heavy gold signet of Netherby caught the light. They descended. Lady Cust met them at the foot of the stair and took Florentia's other hand, as if welcoming a returning daughter. Around them the whispers began, low and quick, like water finding a crack. Cornelius Plumpter was already in the room. He stood by the fireplace in his tobacco-brown coat, the double gold watch chain across his belly, the elaborate cravat overflowing his chin. He had been laughing. He stopped laughing. Osmond did not look at him. Osmond looked instead toward the far end of the ballroom, where 2 men in sober black stood in quiet conversation near a card table. One was the President of the Bank of England. The other was the Attorney General himself. Both had been informed that His Grace of Netherby would be pleased to place a small matter before them before the first waltz. Osmond crossed the room. Florentia walked with him. The Tun parted without knowing quite why it parted. From under his coat, Osmond drew a slim mahogany box. He set it on the card table. He opened it. The papers inside were arranged in the order Lady Cust had suggested: the true will first, the discharged notes second, the Manchester correspondence third, the printer's bill fourth, the undated note about the cordial last. The president of the bank read the top document. He read the second. On the third, his mouth thinned. On the fifth, he set the paper down with the delicacy of a man handling a live coal. The Attorney General read them all without expression. Then he lifted his head and looked once across the ballroom to where Cornelius Plumpter stood by the fire. It was not a long look. It was not a loud look. It was the look of a man marking a name for the morning. Plumpter felt it. His hand rose to his cravat. His hand did not know what to do there, and fell again. A footman came to his elbow with a glass of claret he had not asked for. He waved it off. A second footman came a moment later to remove the glass again. He noticed, as any careful man of business would notice, that both footmen wore the Netherby livery, and that neither had been present in the room a quarter of an hour before. Across the floor, Florentia lifted her chin a fraction. Lady Cust, who had been watching her as a governess watches a pupil at an examination, gave the smallest possible nod. Florentia did not smile. She had promised herself, on the drive down from Netherby, that she would not smile at Cornelius Plumptre. She meant to keep the promise. Word travels through a London ballroom the way fire travels through summer thatch. Within the length of one country dance, the story had crossed the room 3 times, and come back changed only in detail. The Netherby debts were forged. The old Duke had been poisoned. The papers were with the Attorney General. Cornelius Plumptre had been seen to sweat. The Countess of Ashford, who had cut Florentia dead at the Peverell dinner in September, now found reason to smile in her direction across the room. Florentia's smile in return was small and correct and unforgiving. It was the smile of a woman who remembered. Plumptre attempted, once, to leave. 2 gentlemen he did not know were standing near the door. They did not touch him. They did not speak to him. They simply did not move. He returned to the fire. At 11:30, the Attorney General crossed the ballroom, spoke 3 quiet sentences into Plumptre's ear, and walked away. Plumptre's face went the color of tallow. By midnight, his name had been withdrawn from the subscription list of White's. By midnight, the bank had recalled his personal line of credit. By 1, the Morning Post's night editor had been visited by a gentleman in black and had been persuaded, with regret, to spike the article he had prepared about the ruined Duke, and to set instead a small paragraph on page 2 concerning a certain city solicitor now under investigation for forgery and worse. At 2, a writer left for the Marshalsea with a warrant of release signed by the Attorney General's own hand. Julius Wyndham would sleep in a soft bed before dawn, and in the ballroom, the orchestra struck up the first true waltz of the night. Osmond turned to Florentia. He did not speak. He drew off his right glove. He turned the heavy gold signet ring on his little finger, the Netherby crest, worn thin at the edges by 400 years of dukes, and slid it free. The Tun saw. The Tun always sees. He took her gloved left hand. He lifted it. He slid the signet ring onto the 3rd finger of that hand, over the cream kid, where any fool in London could see it. "Miss Sackville," he said. His voice was pitched low, but the room had gone quiet enough to carry it. "I would be honored if the Duchess of Netherby would give me the first waltz." He did not ask a question. He made a declaration and disguised it as courtesy. Florentia looked at the ring on her gloved finger. She looked at the crowd who had called her castle a pauper's grave. She looked at Lady Cust, whose piercing blue eyes were bright with something very like tears and very like triumph. She looked at Osmond, whose storm-gray eyes were, for the first time since she had known him, entirely undefended. She did not answer him. She smiled. She stepped into his arms, and she began, without a word, to waltz. The Tun watched them turn. Somewhere near the fire, Cornelius Plumptre sat down heavily on a small gilt chair that had not been meant to bear him. Nobody offered him another. Later, when the carriages had gone and the candles had burned low, Osmond walked with her, out onto the terrace above the frostbitten square. The signet ring lay heavy on her gloved finger. She did not take it off. She did not answer him yet either. She had spent a life being unseen, and she meant, now, to be very carefully and very slowly seen. Osmond lit a cigar for the first time in a year and did not smoke it. He watched the lamps burn in the square below, and the last of the carriages roll away toward Piccadilly, and the moon come clear at last above the chimney-pots. He had never in his life been given a thing he had not first earned in blood or ledger, and he did not know how to receive one now. He understood. He waited. It was, she thought, the first thing he had ever offered her that no one had forced from him. 6 months later, when the banns were finally read in the little chapel where a young woman in a russet gown had once mended a curtain by candlelight, the inscription above the crypt door had been recut in fresh stone. It read, in the same Latin the old Duke had loved, "Only the worthy shall enter." Florentia Sackville, walking up the aisle in a gown the color of winter cream, understood the words at last not as a threshold but as a promise kept. And so the woman the Tun had once dismissed as the poor relation of a pauper's grave became, in her own time and on her own terms, the Duchess of Netherby, not because a great man had chosen her, but because a great man had, at last, been worthy of being chosen back. She had spent her life being looked past. She would spend the rest of it being truly seen. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Has there ever been a moment in your life when you carried a truth no one around you believed you could understand? the way Florentia carried that iron key beneath her plain russet gown. Have you ever been mistaken for someone small and chosen silence instead of correction until the right person finally saw you? And when justice finally arrived at your door, did it come loudly like a ballroom or quietly, in a language only you could read? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, justice, and love that arrives against all odds, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.